One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, save life or destroy it?" He looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. Now, I'm just going to add the next verse 11 here. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. May God add his blessing to that word. Please, you can be seated. We've been talking this month about learning to lead like Jesus. And I hope through this series of messages that if you've participated, you're catching a vision for the fact that God not just calls us to follow him, although he certainly does that, but he calls us to be leaders, people of influence in his kingdom. And I also hope along the way that this will also influence you in thinking carefully about the leaders whom we choose, whether it's in church or in the secular sphere, because there's a sense that I have that today in the church, we often have a warped sense of what a leader should look like. And so the last few weeks we've talked about the leadership of Jesus. We saw that Jesus had a heart. We need the heart of a leader, that heart begins with a heart for God and also includes a heart for people. Last Sunday we talked about the head of a leader. We are called to have the mind of Christ. The Bible says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And so what that means is whatever is going on inside is eventually going to work itself out. It's eventually going to make its way. It's going to be noticed. People are going to see what's going on inside of you. In fact, in this chapter that we are looking at this morning, we see this demonstrated clearly in verse 45. Jesus is teaching, and this is what he says: "The good man out of the good treasure in his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart." It works itself out every time. Now this morning, I want us to go beyond the heart of a leader and the head of a leader, and let's talk about the hands of a leader. I don't know what your hands might look like this morning, but I remember a few years ago, I was visiting my home church, Fulton Creek Friends Church, down near Richwood, Ohio. That's where I grew up, and there were several members of my family just before Christmas participating in a Christmas cantata. Well, after the service, the gentleman who was sitting behind me, whom I did not know, said to me, "You know, I was looking at your hands. You must either be a teacher or a politician." Well, in that particular community, it's a farming community. And so, men, a lot of men at least, have calluses on their hands. They've been dealing with tractors and grain and grease and all those kinds of things. And you see soft hands like mine, he knew something was up. And so my hands told him something about me. And I'm not sure he was being flattering at all, And so when I told him I'm a pastor, he understood. Because our hands represent our behavior. They are what we do. When we talked about the heart and the head, our primary area of discussion is on what we think and what we feel, but the hands, they represent our behavior, what we do. And the truth is that once our heart and our head are in alignment, a change in our behavior should follow. The hands of a leader who follows Jesus should begin to look more and more like his hands. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's see if we can think about that together this morning. Let's begin here again with verse 1. The scripture says, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through these grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So the Pharisees are carefully watching the disciples, everything they are doing, and they are just leisurely going through a field. They're taking some grain off the stalks. They're rubbing it together to remove the chaff and then just simply eating it. But the problem is this. This was on the Sabbath. And according to the Mosaic law and their interpretation, this was work. They were harvesting and threshing on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees immediately pick up on this. They are legalists to the brim. Someone defined a legalist as a person who is afraid that someone somewhere is having a good time. Legalists seem determined to suck the joy out of everyone's life, including their own. But Jesus is going to have none of this. His hands become hands of protection. He shields the disciples from this unnecessary abuse. Look at verse 3. It says that Jesus answered them. Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful and only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Now I want you to notice that Jesus makes a rather provocative statement right there. He says, "This is my day. This is my day. I'll decide what they can do." Never say that Jesus didn't claim to be Lord. But let me make this illustration. Let's say you are driving. You're about to go through an intersection and the light turns yellow. Now, what does yellow mean? It means go faster, right? And so you're going through that intersection, and suddenly you realize that the light turns red, but you also notice that there's a policeman right there on the side watching everything that's going on. And so suddenly your heart skips a beat. But in your rearview mirror, you notice that the guy behind you also went through that intersection. So how are you feeling? Better. Relieved. Why? Because if anyone is going to get stopped, it's that guy. If anyone is guilty, it's him more than you. It's got to be him. This is what Jesus is doing here. He says to these Pharisees, "You never found fault with your hero David, who ate the consecrated bread in the tabernacle because he and his friends were hungry." It would be like this morning, I uncover the communion table and find that the loaf is not there because Jim got hungry and wanted a snack. Jesus said, "You never said a critical word about David, and yet isn't that a whole lot worse than picking and eating a few seeds of grain on the Sabbath? Get real." That's in the Greek, by the way. It's right there. A leader is not afraid to protect those he loves. Parents, you know about this. Jerry Clower is a comedian, and he says that his son was the place kicker on a really good high school football team. Now, I'm getting excited. We're getting close to football season here. But in an all-important game, his son missed a critical field goal attempt, and wouldn't you know it, a loudmouth fan sitting about 3 rows ahead of Jerry started ripping on his boy, calling him a loser and a choker. And Jerry Clower, big man, short temper, he sat there fuming. He says after the game was over, he couldn't help it. He had to confront and went over to this big-mouth critic. And Jerry kind of towered over him as imposing as he could possibly be, and he growled, "Sir, I just want you to know that Jesus Christ saved your life tonight." The guy said, "What are you talking about? If I hadn't become a Christian several years ago when I heard this loud mouth of you going after my son, I would have killed you in an instant with my bare hands. Jesus Christ saved your life tonight." In our neighborhood, we have some new neighbors at the end of the street. We haven't got to meet them yet, and so we don't know them very well. But this past week, my daughter Faith, who went back to school along with Micah this weekend, they were outside. Actually, Faith was just outside, and she heard a commotion down the street in this lot, and it was more than that. It was a really intense argument. A man and a woman were really going at it, and suddenly the couple took the argument inside, and Faith hears a lot of commotion, bumps, and all kinds of things going on. And just finally, she called 911, just in case. She was concerned. Well, the police came. I think an arrest was, in fact, made. But a few hours go by. Faith and Micah go somewhere else, and then they return to home. And suddenly they see 4 guys who are right there, and they suddenly come toward Faith, and they want to talk to her. Well, my son Micah, who is shorter than I am, but has a huge heart, moved in front and stepped up and stood up for his sister and said, "Can I help you? What seems to be the problem?" All that. Diffused the situation as best he could. And I was so proud of that young man. 1 Corinthians 13:7 says, "Love always protects." Jesus used his hands to protect his children. I remember when he encountered false teaching and immorality in the temple, he used his hands to fashion a whip out of cords and drove out the money changers. That reminds me, as a pastor, one of the things is, as a leader, as elders, we are to protect this place, this community. We see this in the New Testament. Maybe it's from false teaching that can spread like gangrene, and at times we've had to do that. Maybe it's flagrant immorality that can be like yeast and contaminate the whole loaf. Maybe it's a divisive spirit that hurts morale and needs to be confronted. Maybe it's shielding the flock from abusive and unhealthy leadership. But a good leader is perceptive to the danger and isn't afraid to confront when it's necessary to do so. After all these years, I'm still learning this lesson, because the truth is, sometimes as a leader, I've fallen short of this. Maybe you have too. We don't want to confront people because we don't want to cause waves. We're people pleasers. We want them to think well of us. We want to be liked. We don't want to feel bad afterward. And yet the Bible is very clear. We have to be willing to confront that which is harmful. For instance, Jesus says, if you have anything against your brother, go to him personally and tell him his fault, just between the two of you. And if he listens to you, you have won your brother over. A Christ-like leader's hands have to be hands of protection. But I want you to notice something else about this passage. We notice that Jesus also has hands of healing. Jesus' hands healed. In verse 6, we read, on another Sabbath, he went to the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Now, I want to just make this as an aside. You already see these Pharisees. They're doing an awful lot of investigative work on the Sabbath, aren't they? And can you imagine being so dark, so evil, so corrupt, that you come to church that day and you hope, well, I sure hope no one gets healed when I get there. That's how disgusting this is. Jesus cares about people, and he notices that while he is teaching on this Sabbath, that there is a man whose hand is severely withered. Maybe it was from a birth defect. Maybe it was something that happened from work. Maybe it was carpal tunnel. Who knows? But you can be sure it impacted his ability and his life. Now again, the sniveling Pharisees are there watching just to see if Jesus is going to do some work on the Sabbath. And I think the point needs to be made, if you step out to lead, be ready for this. Someone is always going to be there to criticize you, no matter what you are doing, even if it is a very good thing. It's a part of leadership. Not everyone is going to approve. It is always easier to sit in the background and gripe about how you would have done it differently. The world is full of people like that. And yet when Jesus calls us, he calls us to step out and make a difference. And the problem is those who do often get hurt or criticized, and that griping can wear you down and discourage you and bring you to a point where you say, I don't know if it's worth it. And so you step aside and you say, I don't think I'm going to help anymore. In fact, I think the church today is full of people who at one point stepped out. They stepped up. But somewhere along the line, they got hurt. Someone criticized them. Maybe it was justified, maybe it wasn't. And I just want to say, if you're one of those people, remember the leadership of Jesus. Jesus didn't let the fact that there were critics ever keep him from doing what was right. Verse 8 says, "But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Get up and stand in front of everyone.' So he got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to them, 'I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?' He looked around at them all and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He did so, and his hand was completely restored." If you study the gospel ministry of Jesus, you realize how often, in fact, he touched people with his hand. He touched the untouchable leper, and they were made whole. He touched the eyes of a blind beggar, and the blind beggar could suddenly see. He touched the ears of the deaf, and they could hear. He touched the body of a lifeless girl, and she rose up. Jim McGinnis tells about an American soldier in World War II who was in Italy at the time. Jim says as this soldier was walking through the mountains, he suddenly came upon a statue of Jesus. It was partly hidden by the weeds, but as he approached the statue, he suddenly noticed that the hands of Jesus were broken off and nowhere to be found. As he sat meditating on the statue, an inspiration came to him, and he found a piece of paper, and he wrote this on the piece of paper, and he placed it under a rock right in front of the statue. He had given the statue a 6-word name. It was this: "I have no hands, but yours. Should I go to this, Tim? Maybe that will work better. I have no hands but yours. Stacy Bush, who's here somewhere this morning, is an assistant in classrooms working with at-risk students. And the truth is, if you know anything about her job, she's often working with very difficult students who exhibit very difficult behaviors. Well, Stacy has served on our worship team for years, and she's been faithful as a part of that ministry. Well, last spring, she was hit by one of her students. It was an assault, really, and her left hand was severely injured. Months later, I saw her earlier this week, and she was still saying, it's not the same, it still hurts, it still doesn't function like it used to. Well, I recently became aware that her school last spring awarded her with the Positive Education Program Laura Recco Aspire to Excellence Award. That's a mouthful. She was surprised to receive it, but this award was named in honor of a teacher who accompanied students to Huntington Beach several years ago. When one of the students was caught in a riptide, the teacher lost her life trying to save the student. Stacy received the award in honor, and that was honoring that woman. And Stacy told me, Pastor, I can't talk about Jesus in my job. And even when I received the award, I couldn't say too much about my faith. But no one can stop me from being like Jesus to my staff and students. I have no hands but yours. I was thinking this week, as we plan for homecoming and the booth, and we're going to be sharing in various ways, people are going to be noticing what we're doing with our hands. When we take the parade next week, we'll be waving and passing out candy, everything but chocolate, and we'll be having a good time. They're going to be seeing our hands in action. Hands represent our opportunity to share compassion with one another. I hesitated to say anything this morning, and even now I'm kind of wrestling with this, but in May, I became aware of a situation for a family in our church who needs a car. They're a sweet family. I've come to love them and appreciate them. Sadly, their daughter was murdered a few years back. She was 16 or 17 years old. I think that set them back, as you can imagine, just in terms of function for a while. They've been behind in some things, and recently, Dad has discovered that he has cancer. They have a car that they rent for about $750 a month. That's called a rent-a-wreck, and it's $750 a month. It's more than they can afford. It's more than I could afford. And that they need to get to work and appointments and these things. And so in May, it just was laid on my heart by Jesus, I believe, Jeff, you need to get them a car. I've been praying about that and thinking about it and beginning to talk with others about the possibility of raising about $8,500 to get them a vehicle that is able to get them where they need to go. And I just want to publicly let you know that we're raising those funds. If you'd like to be a part, just let me know, and we'll make sure. You could even put it on Care to Share, car, something like that, and we'll make sure that it gets done. But I'd like to do that before too long here, and because I just think, you can't do for everyone. What you do is you do for one what you would like to do for many. And we have one family that I think God's laid it on my heart we need to do something about. So I'll let that be a part of my message this morning. Jesus had, as a leader, hands of protection. Jesus, as a leader, had healing hands. Luke, however, you'll notice in this passage, ends with this ominous phrase, and they discussed together what they might do to Jesus. I told you when that gentleman saw my hands back in Fulton Creek, he noticed how smooth, how soft they were. You know, as I was thinking about this sermon, it occurred to me, you know, Jesus' hands are now and forevermore scarred. It's the ultimate demonstration of his sacrifice. Jesus goes to the cross. The Romans nail driving spikes through those hands, nailing him to a tree. And he bled and he died for my sin. But God demonstrates his own love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But you know, that's not where it ended. After the crucifixion, you'll remember that Luke reports that 2 disciples were on the road to Emmaus. They were getting out of Jerusalem because they saw Jesus die on the cross, and I think partly they were just concerned that they were in danger too. They thought that all their hope was gone. They realized that everything they believed was a lie. But Luke tells us somewhere along that road, they meet a stranger. And they talk. And they convince him to stop and eat with them. You remember the story? And when they break bread, and they look at his hands, their eyes are opened. And they realize he's alive. My Redeemer lives. Thomas, the disciple, he heard the stories. He doesn't believe. He says, unless I put my fingers in the holes of his hands and side, I'm not going to believe. But Jesus shows up. Thomas sees the hands. He feels the hands. He says, my Lord and my God. My Redeemer lives. You see, the hands of Jesus, more than anything, give us hope this morning. Those scars remind us that God has conquered evil. My Redeemer lives. The hands of a leader must stand and proclaim that God is alive, and he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. You are his craftsmanship. Everything is going to be okay. Ultimately, everything is going to be okay. It does not mean that we will not experience want. It does not mean that we won't suffer loss. It won't mean that we won't go through times of pain. But it does mean that, in the words of the Apostle Paul, when I think of Romans 8, what shall separate us from the love of God? Trouble? No. Hardship? No. Persecution? No. Famine? No. Keep going. All things may come at us, but we are more than conquerors. As people who follow Jesus Christ, we can live like it, act like it, talk like it, love like it, give like it, because he is worth everything that we are, because the hands that were nailed to the cross, while forever scarred, they are alive and they're working today, even in this place. The hands of a leader should be hands of hope. And so I ask you this morning, when people see your hands, what do they see? Hands that protect, hands that care and heal, hands that give hope, hands that are busy doing the Father's work. Oh God, give us clean hands and a pure heart.